So after the first week of virtual instruction, I wanted to take some time to reflect on the difference between face-to-face instruction and the typical classroom and our experience or my experience of virtual instruction. Um, and so I did some research about some of the theories behind virtual instruction and some of the instructional strategies that we might be able to use. The idea behind this is just to get maybe a conversation started about good teaching practice in virtual classroom, and maybe also to share some resources back and forth. So this is what my key questions were: is how do we use virtual learning to be able to motivate, encourage meaningful opportunities, and beyond that, deep processing. I found that a lot of my instruction this week was based on surface level questions, and I thought that some of the higher order thinking that was sort of characteristic of most of my classes wasn't always there. Also, how is it best that we are able to use Google Classroom to give relevant feedback, or what kinds of feedback does it look like, and even use the virtual learning environment to encourage interaction. I did some research, and one of the things that I really found is that because we aren't seeing students face to face and we aren't able to kind of deploy different strategies as necessary, it's really important to go into the instructional practice with a really sound theory of what we're doing. And I found that in some of the research articles that I read, that they were able to combine different theories of learning into different aspects of instructional strategy for the virtual learning environment. So they deployed behaviorist tactics for things about facts, what, constructivists were principles and processes, and connectivists to thinking about how things in the classroom or the instructional environment were maybe contextualized to like wider issues. And even some of the ideas that I found was that maybe more than in other traditional learning environments, a virtual environment gives students an opportunity to make really deep personal connections with their learning, and maybe even extend things in ways we hadn't thought about. So my goal in this video was to maybe have a conversation about ways we might be able to use a virtual environment, not only to reproduce what we do in a normal classroom, but even to do things that we wouldn't typically be thinking of doing, or at least that was my experience. One of the things I also found was a really important need to clarify the objectives of each lesson for the students. So the research says because we're not seeing students face to face, it's really, really critical that students begin the lesson with a really clear set of objectives, including some focus questions to contextualize what they'll be learning, and also objectives that are self-assessable. And in fact, the research suggests that students at most levels are able to make good assessment of their own learning, but we have to write, or the idea was that we should be able to write the rationale for the lesson in a way that students can actually go through and see whether or not they've met those targets. I think part of that is because we're not face to face with students. We're sort of asking them to be a little bit more self-reliant on the ability to make a decision whether or not they've gone through the material in the appropriate way. And then the objectives of each of the lesson should also provide a rationale for how it fits. And I think a lot of this has to do with just sort of streamlining. Like, we can't have conversations, we can't look in their eyes, we can't walk around the room. So having a really clear set of objectives with an explicit aim, something that students can test themselves against, and also sort of a wider context of why we're doing things seems to be really important in the research. As for the learner activities themselves, there's a strong push towards using the extended resources for guided discovery, so that I think the advantage in virtual learning is not that we can only reproduce what we're doing like we would give a lecture, but rather give students an opportunity to access the material for themselves and understand what it is and sort of process for themselves what's important to define their strategies and define their outcomes. This came back again and again, this issue about time and space. I think this week I personally was trying to reproduce, as I said, like a face-to-face classroom where we are here, we are all together for the hour and 40 minutes, and it more or less looked like a traditional classroom on a screen. But the research suggests that that's really not the best use of our time and space. because students are kind of probably going to be approaching their lessons differently. We don't actually have to do things in those hour and 40 minutes that we would typically do. So some of the work can be done asynchronously through multimedia investigations, looking at podcasts, having them produce podcasts, having them doing some journaling and all kinds of other activities. And actually, opportunities for reflection should be kind of a key thing in each of these lessons, because so much of this learning is self-directed. That students are going to have to come away with an understanding of whether or not they've met their own objectives. And I think this reflection is something that gets repeated again and again. Another aspect was discussing learner interaction. And learner interaction we typically think of as like interaction between students or between us and students. But in a virtual environment, the literature suggests that this is wider kinds of interactions and different types of interactions. So we think of learner interaction even with the materials that we're providing. And I think that this is a really critical reason why we have to have some really clear learning objectives, that students can understand what it is that they're trying to gather from this material. The learning platform is another sort of avenue of learner interaction. Their colleagues, their instructors, as usual, but also parents. I think this might be, if this quarantine or this isolation continues, something that we'll have to consider. How do we incorporate parents in the learner interaction? And so maybe we think about, especially these first two, and this last one is maybe new avenues to explore for virtual learning. What kinds of materials can we provide that students can go through that asynchronously and still get the resources that they need, still get the content that they need? And another, I think, really critical thing or opportunity that we have in virtual learning is this idea of maybe allowing students to adapt their assessment towards something that's more personally relevant. I think because, we've been talking about how the nature of education is changing, it's changing. Well, I think now we're in a moment where it's changed. We're in a new paradigm, and I think that it's a really good opportunity to have students take a real ownership in not only the learning, but also the assessment and how they're going to be assessed. And if we can clarify the assessment goals or the objectives in the beginning of the lesson or the beginning of the unit, I think we have more freedom, or students have more freedom, and to be able to identify an assessment and adapt an assessment towards something that's personally relevant. So here's maybe a really nice diagram of the kinds of content that might be applicable in this kind of virtual learning environment. This is taken from Anderson, one of the really kind of the core research that I did for this. And it kind of goes through the different stages of what a learner-centered virtual learning environment can look like. Learner preparation, as we spoke about learning outcomes, the different kinds of activities they can have within a particular unit, making use of wider research that's available online, and different opportunities to practice in asynchronous ways. I think it's going to be, for me, it's been interesting to see how the most useful lessons have not always used time, or this week, I should say, the most useful lessons for me this week weren't always the ones that use time in the same way that I would have in a classroom. And so that's been a big adjustment for me to see what actually does work, how much time something does take, and I think that's something that's going to continue to develop over time. This idea of learner interaction is also really important, and maybe this one I didn't mention at the end here, learner support. Thinking about if we have a clearly set of defined goals and objectives for that students can kind of grasp themselves, then there may be opportunities for them to be able to identify issues that come up in their learning in a little bit more clear ways. And I didn't talk about testing or like quizzes, but I think that's a really important part of virtual learning that it's also suggested in the literature that there should be some kind of quizzes, or students can actually do some quantitative self-assessment on top of the reflective stuff. And then this idea of learner transfer. I think personal meaning might be my personal opinion on this, but I think because students are so isolated, or they have the potential to be so isolated, that our learning content is only going to be valuable to them now, especially in this context, if we can find ways to make it directly personally meaningful in ways that we maybe or I hadn't thought about before. And for me, that's going to be something that I'm going to continue to reflect on. What's going to be valuable to get our students or my students through in the next couple of weeks, whether or not they have exams. So I also had a sample lesson here, and this is not to say this is what I'm doing, but rather to get some feedback and to see whether or not this is something that might continue to work. So here are some goals for the unit. So this would have been posted on Google Classroom. There's different activities that are available asynchronously, and then students develop something for themselves. This is actually something I had from the beginning of this year before we went virtual, but I've been using this kind of lesson planning for my virtual learning environment. So please, if you'd be willing to take a look at that and give me some feedback on whether or not that works or it does what I hope it will, or if it's even understandable, please let me know. And then lastly, here's a really great resource. Like I said, it was kind of the primary resource for this today. And I think it's available online for free. And if not, please let me know. I can help you get a copy of that. Okay, thanks for listening. And please give me some feedback. And if there's other suggestions or things that are going on, I'm certainly no expert, but I'm really interested in how we might take this practice forward. Thanks.